Before we get started, I'd like to thank those who have recently joined Patreon. Alan D., Ann B., Melanie E., Stephanie S., Ryan H., Camilla H., Rue A., Melinda C., and Beth C. I'd also like to thank Kiki W. for raising their pledge to the next tier. This week, some of you who joined Patreon in the last several months received a thank you card from me along with a few perks, depending on which tier option you chose. I'm still working on getting the next round of cards out, so if you joined in the last 3 months or so and you haven't heard from me yet, hang on, they are coming if you opted in. After I'm done recording this, I will get on to finishing up our part 6 in the exclusive series for you guys on Patreon. So thank you so much for your patience with all of this. In part 1 of this series, and if you're just listening to this now, this is the second part of a 2-part series entitled The Tale of the Kevorkian. So if you haven't listened to part 1, you'll need to go back and listen to that first and then come back to this. We were discussing the case of Jeffrey Locker, a Long Island businessman, motivational speaker, and author who was found dead in his vehicle in Harlem in 2009. A man named Kenneth Miner was quickly arrested in connection with his death, but he claimed that Jeffrey asked him to help him kill himself. We found out that Jeffrey had millions of dollars in life insurance, and he explained to Kenneth that he was worth more dead than alive. So we will pick up the story from there and what exactly Jeffrey meant when he told Kenneth that. So we are going to pick up where Lou Pearlman enters into our story. While I'm sure Jeffrey didn't mention Lou by name to Kenneth, he did explain how he had invested money in this airline company, and it all turned out to be one big, huge scheme. And remember, all of these people hail from generally the same area, sort of. While Long Island is about 60 miles or 96 kilometers from Harlem, Lou was from Flushing, which is only about 20 minutes from Harlem. So Jeffrey was doing business with this guy. He's a fellow New Yorker. He's responsible for the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. He had absolutely no reason to not trust this guy, only to find out that this whole airline business was a fraud, a Ponzi scheme that had been going on for as many as 2 decades. Remember, the story is taking place in 2009. This encounter with Kenneth Miner is on the night of July 14th. Lou's Ponzi scheme had begun falling apart sometime in 2006. He absconded to Indonesia in 2007, but was taken into custody about 6 months later and was ultimately convicted in May of 2008. So Jeffrey's had some time now to let all of this sink in. He apparently told Kenneth that he was suing Lou to try to recover some of the lost money, but it didn't look like it was going well. This was one of the largest and longest running Ponzi schemes. There were so many victims, and who knows how much of it was left to be seized and paid out to those who had lost money. And it was a process that was going to take longer than Jeffrey was willing to wait. And it was likely he was never going to see a penny, which sadly is what often happens in cases like this. Now, I do believe that Jeffrey also solicited investors to put their money into this Ponzi scheme as well, and I believe Jeffrey was being sued himself by some of the people that lost money in the same scheme. People like Lou, they ruin people's lives. He wiped out life savings. He wiped out retirement funds, people's nest eggs. I don't know how bad Jeffrey's financial situation had become after he realized everything he had invested with Lou was gone. But if he's out there trying to find someone to help him stage his death look like a homicide so his family can go on and live a comfortable life without him, then we can only assume that it was pretty bad. And if what Kenneth was saying is true, then this confirms much of what Jeffrey's good friend Steve D'Annunzio had said about him as a person. His complete devotion to his family, his wife, his kids, so much so that he would sacrifice his own life in order for them to be able to go on with a hefty life insurance payout to cushion their grief. It's Hard for me to even say those words, that Jeffrey would take his own life in order to give his family a better one, because I don't see it the same way. I don't see having your husband and father not being around anymore as better for any amount of money. But if the lack of emotional reaction to the news the detective brought to them that Jeffrey was in fact dead, if that said anything, then well, it would be that they were now going to be flush with money, comfortable for the rest of their lives, thanks to Dad for taking one for the team, I guess. It's so weird to me, but okay. Kenneth Miner said he got the impression that losing everything was a worse fate than death to Jeffrey. He said that there was this certain amount of shame that he felt Jeffrey was feeling, that he was failing his family. Jeffrey had shown him pictures that he had with him of his wife and children. They'd become so accustomed to living a fairly lavish lifestyle, and he just couldn't handle the fact that he messed it all up with these terrible investments. And this was his solution to the problem. Now, I do have a theory that the situation was probably worse than Jeffrey had led Kenneth to believe. I think there was more to this story than that he just lost all of his money to bad investments. There's a part of me that strongly believes that Jeffrey may very well have been more involved in the Ponzi scheme than anybody ever realized or knew quite yet. And maybe, just maybe, the heat was about to start to come down onto him. I read some articles that suggested he recruited investors or brokered some of the investments, and he may have been on the hook for all of that money that was lost. Now that Lou Pearlman was in prison for essentially the rest of his life, Jeffrey was at least one person left with perhaps any kind of assets that the victims of the Ponzi scheme could sue, especially if he was the middleman or he earned any kind of commission by bringing in new investors. That, to me, seems like more of a motivation for Jeffrey to do what he did. He could have been on the hook for the millions of dollars stolen from them. He was being sued. He could have been under investigation, or at least thought he was going to be soon. He could have seen himself coming under indictment for the fraud. And he was probably going to go to federal prison too. And I don't know all of that for a fact, but I do know that Jeffrey was being sued in civil court. If he wasn't facing these serious problems, I don't think he would have resorted to the desperate measures that he ultimately did. He obviously saw no other way out, and his family apparently agreed with him. Anyway, Jeffrey was clear with Kenneth. He told him, if you're not going to help me, I will find someone who will. But whatever the case, this was going to happen. Kenneth said there was no fear about what he was saying and what he was wanting to do, that Jeffrey was certain about his decision, though he did sense that there was some sadness. Because according to Kenneth, as the men sat there talking about Jeffrey's fate, his life, his family, his children, his death, the men, in an odd way, sort of connected. They, who would otherwise probably not have ever known each other in this life, yet there they were, with Jeffrey from an entirely different world than Kenneth, seated in that car, having one of the heaviest, most exceptional yet very human conversations that they both would ever have in their entire lives. And after spending some time speaking to Jeffrey, according to Kenneth, a feeling of kindredness swept over him. He felt for Jeffrey, this guy who lived this apparently successful life, pouring his heart out to him. And Kenneth, he struggled through much of his life, living in a rough neighborhood, battles with substance abuse, brushes with the law. These were two very different life experiences. But here was Jeffrey, ready to give up. It probably was a truly unique experience for Kenneth to see that even if you have everything, all that amounts to is meaning that you have so much more to lose. Kenneth didn't see that there was a chance that he was going to be able to say anything to Jeffrey to get him to change his mind. At least that is what he said in his interview. This is where, no matter what Kenneth Miner has to say about this, I will always have a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that he didn't just walk away from Jeffrey. This was a very short period of time that these men got to know each other. Jeffrey was essentially nobody to Kenneth. But I understand the feelings and emotions that can be conjured up in these really intense situations. I watched the interview with Kenneth a couple of times, and I tried to look and see if I felt like he was being heartfelt, or if he really didn't care either way. He just needed to get the money out of Jeffrey and, whatever. Maybe it was a little of both. It's hard for me to accept that Kenneth felt so strongly for Jeffrey, and that the state that he was in, the emotional state, that he honestly got to a point where he genuinely wanted to help this man out, thereby helping out his wife and kids. If Kenneth was convinced he was doing the honorable thing, or if really it was just all about the money. But like I said, maybe it was a little of both. Kenneth said Jeffrey promised him access to his bank account. He could take his ATM card, and he gave him his PIN number, 1322. So what does giving of the PIN number say to you guys listening? Kenneth had it. He's remembered it all these years later. He accessed Jeffrey's account successfully at least 5 times and withdrew over $1,000. Either Jeffrey willingly gave him the PIN number in return for helping him stage his death to appear like a homicide, or Kenneth forced the PIN number out of him before killing him, and was lucky that Jeffrey provided him with the correct PIN. We've heard of cases where someone is trying to force a victim to give up their PIN number to their ATM card, only for the person robbing them to find that they were given a fake number. The victim may figure, well, they're going to kill me anyway, I might as well do what I can to make sure they can't take my money on top of that. To me, if Kenneth was robbing Jeffrey, I think he would have taken his whole wallet. I don't think he'd bother to ask Jeffrey politely to remove his ATM card from his wallet and hand that over to him. It does sound like Jeffrey willingly gave Kenneth the card and the PIN, in exchange, of course, for his help. Again, I cannot understand why Kenneth just didn't take the card and run, grab some cash out of an ATM and never look back. But he didn't do that. And I guess maybe he felt like he had to live up to his end of the bargain. I don't know. It's just weird to me that he would have agreed to do something like this, but he apparently did and wanted to make good on his promise. Since he couldn't find a gun, they, I guess, sat there contemplating how they were going to do this. The first thing Kenneth said was that he tried to strangle Jeffrey with that phone cord that he ripped out of the wall at his crack dealer's apartment. But the cord didn't hold up, and it ended up snapping under the pressure of trying to tighten it around Jeffrey's throat, according to Kenneth. Jeffrey then told him that he had a knife in the glove box of his car and instructed Kenneth to grab a hold of it, to hold it up against the middle of the steering wheel, and Jeffrey said that he would thrust his body forward onto the blade, which Jeffrey did 4 times in quick succession. But even with these stab wounds to his chest, Jeffrey still had the wherewithal to have some sort of understanding that this may not have been enough to be fatal. If he's wanting to kill himself, if he's really set on getting this done, he's sitting here trying to make sure that this gets done right. According to Kenneth, Jeffrey instructed him to shift the blade of the knife a little to the right, a bit closer to his heart, where it would be located in his chest. Kenneth did as he was told, and Jeffrey proceeded to thrust himself into the blade twice more. And that was Kenneth Miner's story to the detectives. And it goes without saying, they were pretty unconvinced. However it was Kenneth Miner was feeling or thinking when he got out of the car, we can only speculate on. He admitted that he was drunk and high when he did, but he did say that he was certain that Jeffrey was still alive when he exited the vehicle. He could hear him breathing, but it was shallow and he could hear gurgling. Kenneth said in his interview that Jeffrey had a smirk on his face, which I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to mean or if it was even a smirk at all. I've never really looked at a dying person in the face to be able to describe their expressions. Smirking would not have been the first thing that would have come to my mind, but that's what Kenneth said, that Jeffrey smirked. But it seemed like at this point Kenneth was agitated. He wanted to get out of there, and he said in his interview that as he got out of the car, the men looked at each other. Kenneth asked Jeffrey if he was happy now that he was getting what he wanted. He didn't say if Jeffrey answered him or not, and Jeffrey Locker died shortly thereafter, alone in his car at that street corner in Harlem, as a result of 6 stab wounds to the chest. He was 52 years old. Everybody who heard Kenneth's story, whether they be law enforcement, news reporters, the media, everyone was like, yeah, right. There is no way this guy left his cushy little home in the suburbs, drove into Harlem to look for somebody to kill him. Who does that? Well, apparently Jeffrey Locker did. Kenneth was promptly charged with murder, and while people charged with murder will say and do the darndest things, as the investigation went along, the more it was becoming apparent that may very well have been exactly what Jeffrey Locker was doing. It goes without saying that nobody believed Kenneth's story at first. Not the detectives, not the media, not even Kenneth's own attorney, public defender assigned to the case named Dan Gotlin. But as the police investigation went chugging along, detectives soon learned that Kenneth Miner was not the first person that Jeffrey had approached about this death proposal. A man named Melvin Fleming had a story just as incredible as Kenneth. Incredible because it was nearly the exact same story of a chance meeting with Jeffrey Locker. And as the tale came pouring out of Melvin, it gave everyone pause. Could Kenneth Miner be telling them the truth? That Jeffrey actually had a death wish? As it turns out, Jeffrey did. About 2 nights before he met with Kenneth, he met with Melvin, also a resident of Harlem. Well, I don't know if he actually lived in Harlem, if he had a place there, or if he was just there hanging out, but he was on a street corner, just as Kenneth had been when Jeffrey drove up. Melvin asked him for 25 cents. Jeffrey pulled a $5 bill from his wallet and handed it to him, and he was pleasantly surprised when he'd only asked for a quarter. So Melvin thanked him and said, if he needed anything else, just say the word. And well, we all know what Jeffrey wanted. He was going to go ahead and take Melvin up on his offer. He did say anything. The men started talking, and Jeffrey basically explained the same things to Melvin that he had explained to Kenneth, that he was looking around for someone to help him stage his own death to appear to be a homicide. He specifically told Melvin that he was looking for gang members to help him out, according to Melvin. Jeffrey's words were, to make me dead. And just like Kenneth, Melvin started seeing dollar signs dancing around as he told Jeffrey, that's a tall order, using the mafia as an example of how expensive it can be to hire one of them to do a job like this. And if you want to have a child killed, the price is automatically doubled. Now, dreamers, I question this, because I've done a couple of bonuses about the mafia. And there had been this code of honor once you become a made man. And one of those is that you do not murder women and children. So I thought, well, if that's the case, then Melvin here is kind of just blowing smoke up Jeffrey's ass. The mafia don't have prices on killing children because it goes against their code of honor. But just to make sure, I looked it up, and apparently it's kind of a myth, as there have been killings of children carried out by the mafia, children as young as toddler aged. It doesn't look like they've ever really made a habit of murdering children specifically, but they aren't completely above it. The story I looked at was about a 3-year-old who was murdered in Italy in 2014, and another 3-year-old earlier in the year. And to me, obviously these kids are not members of the mafia, but they were with relatives One was with his mother, and the other was with his grandfather. And these adults either were or were with people who were being targeted, and the children may very well have been collateral damage. But even so, it debunks the whole concept of this code of honor that the mafia claimed to abide by. Anyway, that's another story for another day. So, since Melvin started bringing up what the mafia charges for murders, he's obviously looking for an opportunity to get some money out of Jeffrey, just as Kenneth had as well. Jeffrey figured he needed to find someone who was down and out, someone desperate to earn some cash. I'm not sure how much Jeffrey considered that he might be double-crossed while in the process of looking for someone to help him. Melvin said that he would help him, but in the back of his mind, he really had no intentions of killing Jeffrey. He just wanted to get some money, however much he could, and then ditch him. Melvin just didn't seem to have developed the same connected feelings with Jeffrey that Kenneth said that he did after talking to him and seeing how sad and desperate this guy was, how he had lost everything and ruined his family, that he wanted to end his life so they can go on and live comfortably without him. I mean, I'm sure both men were in it for the money, but only one of them would end up living up to his end of the deal. So, over the course of 2 nights, Melvin and Jeffrey drove around Harlem talking about staging his death, looking for the best spot for it to take place, how they wanted to do it. Maybe it would be a stabbing, a shooting, beating him to death. They apparently talked about all sorts of ideas, but Jeffrey was adamant this had to look like a robbery. It had to appear to be a homicide, and his body needed to be found. After 2 nights of trying to figure this out, and it was coming down to the wire, this needed to happen. But in this world, it's probably easier to find yourself a con artist than it is to find yourself a murderer. Melvin Fleming never killed anyone, and he never intended to start with Jeffrey Locker. His intentions all along was to con Jeffrey out of as much as he could, but he was not going to help him carry out his own death. In the end, Melvin managed to finagle nearly $7,000 from Jeffrey before Melvin directed him to a nearby housing project where he said he'd be able to buy a gun from a guy that he knew. Melvin told him to wait there, that he'd be right back, and he never returned. Within a matter of hours, Jeffrey met Kenneth. Investigators got to the point where they were like, okay, we are starting to believe Kenneth's story. Much of what he was saying was being corroborated, and more information would come to light that would continue to back up what he was claiming. That Jeffrey had Kenneth kill him that night, and he did so willingly. Even though Jeffrey's longtime friend, Steve D'Annunzio, said that there was no way that that was the case, not the guy that he knew for many years, and that may have been his immediate reaction, the evidence was piling up to show that it was likely a thing that Jeffrey actually wanted and did. And I don't know if Steve has changed how he's felt about that, but in some cases it really doesn't matter how much Jeffrey's friends and loved ones say that it was something he would never do. If the evidence is proving otherwise, then investigators and us looking into this story have to go where it takes us. And like I said early on, I believed Steve when he said Jeffrey Locker was absolutely dedicated to his family and devoted to his wife. It was a thing that had come into question early on when there was a witness stating that Jeffrey had purchased condoms at a nearby convenience store in Harlem the night that he died. There was no evidence that that ever happened, and there was nothing else that ever showed that Jeffrey's love and devotion to his family ever came into question. That being said, who's to argue that his faithfulness and his devoutness to his wife and his children ran so deep that when finding himself in dire financial straits that he would not make this ultimate sacrifice to spare his family the struggle and embarrassment of financial ruin. Perhaps Jeffrey's suicide was his biggest and final atonement for the investment risks that he took that landed them in this situation in the first place. The Jeffrey Locker that Steve knew, the one that everyone who was friends with him or associated with him knew, that was the successful motivational speaker with the beautiful family and the expensive home in the suburbs. Of course, that Jeffrey Locker isn't going to necessarily tick all the boxes that people think need to be ticked in order for him to have been at risk for suicide. Lots of people who seemingly have everything do reach those depths of despair. People who didn't lose everything the way that Jeffrey had, they still go to that dark place. That being said, what about the Jeffrey Locker who was on the brink of losing everything he'd spent his life building for himself and his family? The irony in all of this is the fact that he was a motivational speaker who conveyed those exact sentiments to audiences. His book, Teachings for a New World, Journey to a New World of Inner Peace, Family Unity, Better Health, Financial Success, and Improved Relationships. Everything he built his career on was wiped out by some bad investments and this Ponzi scheme. In some ways, Jeffrey Locker was a victim. He was a victim of Lou Pearlman and his financial transgressions. Like I said earlier, there's a part of me that thinks that perhaps Jeffrey Locker was partially responsible for some of that as well. But to me, it sounded like Jeffrey bore the brunt of the blame for what happened. Even though Lou Pearlman may have been mostly to blame, there's still that unknown factor of how much of this Jeffrey was responsible for. This may have been his way out of his troubles, but it also seems as though it may have been his way of making up for this, and it was going to enable his family to cash in on his various life insurance policies, reportedly totaling $12 million. That is the Jeffrey Locker that was planning his own death, not the one that's seen in all of his motivational videos speaking to audiences about succeeding in life. Not the Jeffrey Locker that Steve D'Annunzio had known all these years. And Jeffrey's bad investments in Lou Pearlman's Ponzi scheme weren't the only financial problems that he was having. He was in a lot of debt, his mortgage was huge, and if he was being affected like everyone else in the country at the time, it's quite possible he was upside down with his mortgage as well, or he was getting to that point. And in addition to that, when it comes to his dealings with Lou Pearlman, Jeffrey may have brokered some investments too. I had mentioned this earlier, because it was confirmed that he was being sued by people who had lost a lot of money in this scheme. So it was all kinds of financial problems coming from every which way. So through the late spring and into the early summer of 2009, Jeffrey began buying an astonishing amount of life insurance on his own life. While depending on the terms of the policy, claims can be paid out in the event of a suicide, but there is usually a suicide provision. Most policies are 2 years, but that can vary. These provisions are specifically in place just so you can't do that. You can't load yourself up on life insurance policies and then commit suicide the next day. Jeffrey wasn't interested in waiting for the suicide provision to expire. He had concocted this plan to make it so his family would be able to collect. And the plan was to find somebody to kill him. And we hinted at this earlier, but it sounds as though Jeffrey's family, his wife, and his children, it appeared as though they were in the know about it. I will just tell you now that nobody in Jeffrey's family has ever spoken publicly about his death or this case. I understand wanting to keep their privacy in a case like this, but a lot of times, we see family and loved ones who want to come forward in a sensational case like this, and they want to talk about the person who was killed. They want to share memories or defend their reputation, at least present a side to them that humanizes them for those of us on the outside looking in. But then there are those who just flat out refuse, and in the 11 years since this has happened, there has not been one single thing spoken about this publicly by Jeffrey's wife or any of his children, who are, of course, adults now, possibly even with children of their own. Kenneth Miner is fairly certain that Jeffrey's family were aware of what he was planning on doing because he said Jeffrey told him that he already said all of his farewells to everyone, his family included. He was going to do this for the betterment of them, so he could ensure their financial security. And honestly, I find this incredibly disturbing, if it is true. Unfortunately, here the only thing we can do is make our own assumptions about the Locker family and their role in the plan for Jeffrey to end his life. A couple of things that led me to believe they did know include their unremarkable reactions to the news the detectives came with that Jeffrey was discovered dead in his car. The way the detectives described it in their interviews, these are homicide detectives, so they've seen a lot in their careers and have made plenty of death notifications. But this one was memorable to them in that everyone was so indifferent about the news, and they indicated how strange that whole encounter with the Locker family was for them. Of course, everyone reacts differently to this type of thing, but it stands out to me because it stood out to the detectives. What also gets to me is what I was just talking about, how the family never made a public statement, not even through a family representative or an attorney, nor did they ever attend a single day of the trial that was to come. I'm skipping ahead here a bit, but yeah, they never went to hear any of the information that came out at trial about Jeffrey's death. That I found completely bizarre, because when a murder happens, most people want answers to their questions. And I tend to believe that perhaps the family weren't looking for answers because they didn't have any questions, and that was because they already knew all they needed to know. And really, all they needed was a murder conviction and boom, payday. All the insurance would be paid out. At least they thought it would be. And I'll talk more about how I feel about the Locker family later on. And while I remain skeptical about some of what Kenneth Miner had to say about his interactions with Jeffrey, I believe a good part of what he did say. I think maybe he added on a bit more to the story when it came to the unusual way in which they connected that night when Kenneth felt for Jeffrey and decided that he was in some way meant to be there that night specifically for him, and he felt like he was really helping a very desperate man. I don't know about all that being truly genuine because there's always that money angle. Money's a big motivator, bigger than an emotional connection two strangers in the night could form, especially for Kenneth, who was clearly struggling through life with his addictions and his troubles with the law and whatnot. And in addition to this, the first man Jeffrey tried to get to help him to stage his homicide, Melvin Fleming, he too said that he was told by Jeffrey that his family knew what his plans were and they were okay with it. And this bothers me so much, but it gets even worse. The investigation uncovered evidence in the form of text messages that appeared to show Jeffrey's family were well aware of his plan to end his life. Text messages that Jeffrey had received from his son, who was still a teenager at the time, and in this text message exchange, Jeffrey and his son are discussing a video that Jeffrey was making for his children. A video for his kids to watch as the years without him are going to pass by, for the moments of their lives that he's going to miss. Jeffrey's teenage son suggested to him that he remember to record a particularly important message for his sister, Jeffrey's daughter, who was only 13 years old at the time of his death. He reminded his dad to give her a special message for her to have on the day that she gets married, because it is a day when a father is supposed to give their daughter away. And because Jeffrey wouldn't be there for that special moment, his son wanted him to remember to acknowledge her wedding day and to tell her that he would be there in heaven, looking down, giving her away spiritually. This text message from his son is strong evidence that he, at the very least, knew what his dad was planning to do, which is just really sad. I don't know if the 13-year-old knew. But remember, she is the one who said she was going back to bed when the detectives broke the news to her, her brothers, and her mother that their father was dead. She just wanted to go back to bed. Further evidence of Jeffrey's planning was uncovered through the investigation, as it was clear he was looking for a way out of life. He had conducted some searches on making funeral arrangements, as well as he had written an email to his wife Lois where he provided her with a list of instructions on how to manage the assets when he was gone. Investigators also found all of the documentation confirming the recent purchase of millions of dollars of extra life insurance about a month and a half before he died. As I said, the Lockers would never speak about this and turned down invitations to be interviewed about Jeffrey. But again, his longtime friend Steve, he strongly denies that the family would have been on board with this, that they would have been okay with Jeffrey planning to commit suicide, especially his wife. He noted the marriage, that they were best friends. To Steve, there is no way that Louise Locker was going to stand by while her husband went down this dark path alone. He said that Lois would have done anything, given up everything, sold everything off, and started from scratch if it meant it would save his life. But if Lois ever protested, of which there is no indication she did, it was either not very impassioned, or it fell on deaf ears, or she never really tried. I just don't get the feeling, based on all we know about the Locker family and the conclusions that we were able to reach, that they were really all that broken up about Jeffrey's desire to die. And maybe like everyone else on the periphery of the story, Melvin Fleming, Kenneth Miner, those people, perhaps the Lockers' grief was subjugated by the lure of money too. Lots of money. Millions, in fact. I don't know how Jeffrey's suicide seemed like the best option to all of these people, but, different strokes for different folks. I'd give anything to have my dad back in my life. He wanted to be there for me, and he especially wanted to be there for his granddaughter. And then I wondered what was going on with Jeffrey when he began entertaining the idea of suicide, one staged to look like a homicide in order for his family to collect on his life insurance. I wondered if he confided in Lois about it for some time prior to actually carrying it out. I wondered if he opened up to her about this and his struggles, if he reached out to her, if he was perhaps open to being talked down from that ledge. Maybe at the beginning of all this, he was hoping for Lois to throw him a lifeline. But instead, she was like, "Oh, cool idea, let's do it." And Jeffrey, already feeling despair, had the support of his wife. So with nothing and nobody to stop him, he went full speed ahead on this collision course where he ultimately crossed paths with Kenneth Miner. And for Lois, if she was on board with Jeffrey killing himself, why in the world would she be okay with that as opposed to pleading with him to stay with her in life? And if not for that, then to please stay in the lives of their children, to be there with them and for them, even if it meant that they were broke or if he was behind bars. They really need a dad more than any amount of money. That conversation could have taken place. But when I think about that text message that Jeffrey got from his son, telling him to not forget to make a special message for his daughter for her wedding day, a day which he would not live to see, you get this incredibly eerie feeling that not only did they know, but they were bizarrely okay with it. Steve D'Annunzio said what I was thinking. There are other solutions to problems like this, and for Jeffrey dying in order to collect life insurance to be the one that they land on seems, for most of us, to not even be an option. As a family, they would figure it out, he said, together. Sell the house, file for bankruptcy, downsize. Anything but suicide to collect on life insurance. Yet for the whole family to be on board with it, I just have had a hard time throughout this case reconciling that in my mind. I don't know if everyone was in this strange place in their heads with it. Maybe they were in denial or disbelief. Like, there's no way that Dad's going to find anybody to help him do this. Maybe it was a strong desire to allow Jeffrey to have what he wanted. If he wants to die, who are they to try and stop him? Perhaps it was the lure of millions of dollars. That kind of money would cushion the blow. At least that was their thinking. Maybe mom and dad went ahead and prepped their kids for it. Maybe their kids were too young to really grasp what it meant for dad to be dead, the concept being too abstract. If there was a strong belief in the hereafter, that dad would be at peace in heaven, that could have been okay with everybody. I don't know, but I do strongly believe that they all knew, at least the 2 of the 3 kids, the older ones. I'm not sure if the 13-year-old was in on it yet. If she was, if mom and brothers were telling her, yeah, dad's going to go and die, but the upside is we're going to be rich, to me, that's just cruel. Like, she really didn't have to know. And for them to talk about making a video with Jeffrey wishing his kids all the best as they reached life's milestones after he's gone, I find that to be cruel too. It's different if a parent has a terminal illness and wishes to make videos because they know that they're not going to be there for life's important moments to come in the future. It's another thing for that video to be a part of a suicide plan. And for the kids to take part in that too, and mom, it's just a strange thing to have happened with this family. So, for some of what Jeffrey's friend Steve had to say about him, this here is pretty strong evidence that Jeffrey was a man who would plan his own murder, no matter how much Steve says that he wouldn't. He was a guy who went looking around for someone to help him carry it out. But Steve insisted what Kenneth Miner is claiming is not possible. It just didn't happen that way. But for Kenneth, well, it really didn't matter what happened that night when it comes to the law, even if he had the best of intentions, even if he was helping Jeffrey to do the honorable thing by his family, even if he experienced a next-level connection with a man who reached the depths of desperation, a place perhaps Kenneth himself has felt he's been at times too in his own life, and found it to be so relatable. None of that matters in the eyes of the law. You just can't kill people, even if they want it. Kenneth was to be charged with murder, but he claims that that's not the correct label for this event. He said in an interview on CBS, "This is not a murder. This doesn't warrant a murder charge." He called himself the building off which Jeffrey leapt. His attorney's intentions was to portray Kenneth as an unwitting patsy in Jeffrey Locker's own death plan. Kenneth was the instrument with which Jeffrey used to end his own life. He specifically picked Kenneth and preyed on his weaknesses and his likeliness to go along with his plan. He targeted him and used his skills of persuasion to talk him into and to pay him into helping him die, and for it to appear to be a homicide. But I guess neither Jeffrey nor Kenneth thought any further beyond the actual act itself. The fact is, when there is what is thought to be a murder, then there will be a murder investigation pursuant to that. I don't know if Jeffrey really cared whether or not Kenneth was left holding the bag for his death or not, but clearly Kenneth wasn't thinking too far beyond that either. And if anything, he probably thought if he helped Jeffrey to end his life, then that's a pretty good defense and he'd walk. But that's not how this is going to work. The prosecution was like, okay, we get it. We concede to the fact that Jeffrey wanted to die. All the evidence points to that. We're not even going to try to contest it. But a murder is a murder, no matter which way you slice it. Jeffrey Locker may be responsible for why he is where he is today, but Kenneth Miner is responsible for why everyone is in the courtroom right now. Kenneth Miner could have said no. He should have said no. He should have walked away and went on with his evening, but he didn't. He could have just taken Jeffrey's money and run, just like Melvin Fleming did before him. And when it came to the connection that Kenneth said he had with Jeffrey, this being an act of benevolence and compunction, That all went out the window when Kenneth started making withdrawals on Jeffrey's account within 30 minutes of being seen on surveillance getting out of Jeffrey's car after helping him stab him in the chest. This wasn't about Kenneth's kindness and humanity. It was all about the money. And Kenneth would point to the time the men spent together discussing this. Several hours, talking about family and everything that was going on that brought both of these men to that Harlem street corner that night. And that, Kenneth says, was enough for the two of them to establish a rapport. He said in his interview, quote, "People make connections with other people under strange situations. It might sound a little morbid, but I was kind of privileged to be there for this. It's like your last, you know? Nobody else will ever see you again. Nobody. And you chose me." Kenneth admitted that once they settled on the stabbing, he was the one who held the knife in front of Jeffrey's chest, placing the butt of it on the steering wheel while Jeffrey was the one who lunged his body onto it. Detectives didn't believe it was possible for Jeffrey to have done that 6 times, that Kenneth had to have had a more active role in the actual stabbing. Kenneth's attorney believed it could be done that way, the way that Kenneth described it. And we know that knife wounds in the chest aren't rapidly fatal. The horn of the car didn't go off the night this happened. And when the car was looked at and the horn tested, it was revealed that it was not functioning. I tried looking it up online to see if this was a thing that could be done on the spot, or if it was something that needed to be fiddled with in advance, and I couldn't really find a straight answer. So I did ask in the Facebook group just now, as I wrote that, to see how it's done, so I'll come back to that issue in a moment. Okay, so it seems as though the disconnecting of the horn, according to your answers, would involve going under the hood of the car and removing the fuse for the horn. I looked up horn malfunctions, and there were a couple of threads about the horn on a Dodge Magnum where it just randomly stopped working, and one person said everything connected around the steering wheel column had stopped working in their car, and that included the horn, the blinkers, and the windshield wipers. There was talk about something going wrong in the steering column itself. So, with the car horn being disconnected or not working, Kenneth's attorney believed that this was an indication of how much planning went into this for Jeffrey. At first, I kind of wasn't sure I believed that or not, because it seemed as though Jeffrey's first thought was to find someone who could gain access to a gun and just shoot him. I don't know if he thought far ahead enough, planning for the inability to find someone with a gun, so instead he would disconnect his own horn so they could use the steering wheel as a backing to place the butt of his knife while he stabbed himself, to ensure that they would not disturb the surrounding areas with the sound of the horn beeping a half dozen times. But then Kenneth never said Jeffrey took the time to do that on the spot, so if he did disconnect it, he would have had to have done it in advance. He did also have the knife in the glove box, so maybe he was thinking that he might kill himself in this manner, and he was thorough enough to remember that he'd have to disconnect the horn so he wouldn't be drawing attention to himself. So I can't say for sure if the theory that Jeffrey disconnected it in advance in anticipation of using the knife, holding it on the steering wheel in order to stage the homicide actually happened, or if it was a malfunction of the horn. Nobody in this case ever really said. The only thing noted was that the horn wasn't working. Anyway, the Dodge Magnum was manufactured for several years in the mid-2000s, with production ending in 2008 because of low sales. And from the forums that I was looking on, it seems like the car itself had a number of mechanical issues. I can't say that I've seen any on the road recently, but now that I've said that, I'm probably going to start seeing them all the time. We always seem to get into the minutiae of these cases, but all these details really interest me, but let's move on. Kenneth's attorney was wanting to deal out a plea for this case, insisting that this wasn't murder, this was at most manslaughter. So Kenneth was willing to admit to the wrongdoing. He just didn't see this as a murder in the traditional sense. If Kenneth were to be convicted of manslaughter, if the prosecutor would have been willing to accept that plea, then the most time Kenneth would have spent in prison would have been 15 years. But a murder conviction could amount to Kenneth being in prison for the rest of his life. He was willing to accept responsibility for what he believed his part in Jeffrey's death was, but to him, it wasn't a murder and Jeffrey wasn't a murder victim. This was a fate of his choosing. This is what Kenneth's attorney wanted the jury to have an understanding of. And it wasn't only about Jeffrey ending his life. It was about him and his family attempting to scam his life insurance carriers, everybody that he owed money to, everyone that was suing him. Even though Jeffrey may have fallen victim to a Ponzi scheme, he himself had victimized others in the same scheme, and this was his way of getting away with bilking all of these people and companies out of millions of dollars, while at the same time making sure his family would be set. Well, what did the forensic pathologist have to say about Jeffrey's death? It was not ruled a suicide. He ruled it a homicide. So there's that hurdle. All of the stab wounds were in a formation described as a small cluster, and the wounds also appeared to be coming from the right and downward, consistent with someone seated next to Jeffrey in the passenger seat, stabbing the knife into his body from that direction. So what I'm getting at here is the case is hinging on whether the knife was being held in place against the steering wheel or if it was being physically thrust into Jeffrey by Kenneth. But Kenneth's attorney managed to bring in the big guns when it came to expert testimony from their own forensic pathologist, Dr. Cyril Wecht. We've talked about him in the past. I've discussed him before. He's best known for his opinion on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He consulted on the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the murders committed by the Manson families, and Jeffrey's case here is listed on Dr. Wecht's Wikipedia page. And he said that what the defense is claiming is possible. A person could have thrown himself on the knife 6 times the way Kenneth said it happened, and it's possible that it only took a few seconds for all 6 wounds to have been inflicted. And the fact that the wounds were in a tight cluster, it was indicative of there not having been any kind of struggle. According to Dr. Wecht, if Kenneth had been attacking Jeffrey, the wounds would have been all over the place. There would have been indications of a struggle, but as it were, all of these stab wounds were in a neat 6-inch circumference. But it is still hard to imagine someone throwing themselves on a knife 6 times the way Kenneth described. However, Dr. Wecht would say, you just don't know what people are capable of once they decide they want to end their lives. The experts did disagree on how much pain Jeffrey would have been experiencing once the first wound was made. Dr. Wecht said that once you're in the moment and a knife has gone in past the skin, the pain diminishes. But the prosecution expert did not agree with that assessment, that every wound would have been excruciating, which makes it much harder to believe that Jeffrey did this to himself and did so deliberately, and for lack of a better word, he did it so neatly. And what about the lack of blood on the steering wheel or on the dashboard? If Jeffrey was throwing himself onto the knife, wouldn't there have been blood splatter all over the place? Which it was not. There was no blood found on the steering wheel or on the steering column or anywhere on the dashboard. But Dr. Wecht said the reason for the lack of blood is because in all of those 6 stab wounds, none of them sliced through any major artery. The wounds bled out slowly. All the blood wound up saturated into the shirt that Jeffrey was wearing, and that is where it stayed. He wasn't spurting blood everywhere as he lunged onto the knife. The jury wasn't really going to have to decide whether or not Jeffrey wanted to die here. They needed to decide how much of a role Kenneth had in his death and what his ultimate goal was. Were Kenneth's intentions honorable or were they nefarious? The prosecutor saw calling this case an assisted suicide as an attempt to sugarcoat the truth. A murder is a murder, and the motive was money. As it turns out, the jury really didn't see Jeffrey Locker very favorably, and they found that they each had a measure of compassion for Kenneth here in this case. They felt that both sides of this, the prosecution and the defense, that their individual truths were bent and shaped in the best way that they could to fit their goals. But there was a more human side to this story that both sides missed. So it was a challenging decision because all of that needed to be put aside in order to sift through everything to get to the truth and apply the law appropriately. And the jury really believed there had to have been more to this than Kenneth's desire to make cash, just like we've been trying to sort it out in our own minds here as we've gone over the story. How is it Kenneth arrived at this place where he decided that the right thing to do was to help this man whose life was spiraling, a virtual stranger who was nobody to him? Why did he want to do this? It was troubling to the jury, and it's troubling to us to this day. But they had to do what the instructions and the law told them to do, and they found Kenneth guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. It didn't matter if Jeffrey wanted to die or not. What Kenneth did, as defined by the instructions that the jury was given, was murder. The jury decided that, based on what they were told, this was not a case of assisted suicide. This was not the Kevorkian Kenneth described it as. He had more of a hand in Jeffrey's death than that. Kenneth would continue to say to anybody who would listen, if Jeffrey was here today, he would tell everyone that he would not want Kenneth Minor sitting in prison for potentially the rest of his life for what he helped him to do. This is not where he would want him to be. Kenneth believes that he should not be there for what he did. The only person who is exactly where he wanted to be is Jeffrey Locker, and that there is something to be said about that. He believes that he should not be paying with his life for something Jeffrey wanted. Again, Jeffrey's family never showed up at court. They never did hear any of what Kenneth had to say. They did not attend the sentencing. They did not provide any sort of impact statement. A part of what Kenneth said at his sentencing hearing is that he doesn't know why he agreed to help this man who he didn't even know to do this thing. What it was, what came over him, he had no explanation for. As for the $4 million worth of life insurance policy that Jeffrey purchased about a month and a half before his death, his wife Lois filed a claim, and she was denied. She next filed a lawsuit against the insurer, but she lost her case and was unable to collect on that policy. As for the other $8 million, it isn't clear when Jeffrey purchased those policies, and the insurance carrier was unwilling to comment about whether or not the family was paid out. So we don't know if Jeffrey's death was all for naught. Kenneth Minor appealed his conviction, and a decision was made in October of 2013. According to the court documents related to the appeal, the state never disputed that Jeffrey had gone to Harlem in July of 2009 in an effort to find someone to help him kill him, and the motive were his mounting financial problems, and this was a plan that he came up with in order to allow for his family to be able to collect on his life insurance policies. When he met Kenneth, he explained to him the situation and wanted his death to appear like a robbery homicide. From there, Jeffrey instructed Kenneth to retrieve the knife from his glove box, hold it up against the steering wheel with the blade pointed towards his chest, and from there, he would lean his body quickly into the knife several times, even telling Kenneth to move the knife to the right so it would cut into his heart. He leaned into it a couple more times before Kenneth got out of the car, with Jeffrey still alive as he exited. Both sides of this case at trial, the prosecution and the defense, agreed to the fact that Jeffrey sought Kenneth's help to make his death appear to be a murder. What they disputed was how the knife wounds were actually inflicted. The state's medical expert testified that the nature of the wounds were not consistent with Kenneth's account of what happened, that he was the one who stabbed Jeffrey in the chest. The defense's expert forensic pathologist testified that it could not be ruled out that Jeffrey himself was the one who impaled himself onto the knife being held in position against the steering wheel by Kenneth. So when it came to the jury instructions, they were given information as it pertains to the elements of second-degree murder, but also to the defense of assisted suicide. I'll try to be as clear about this as possible because it's a lot of legal speak. But the jury was told that a person was guilty of murder in the second degree when, with intent to cause the death of another person, he causes the death of such person. It further states that it is an affirmative defense that the defendant's conduct consisted of causing or aiding, without the use of duress or deception, another person to commit suicide. The criminal jury instruction, as a standard, mirrors the words of the law or the statute on this. In his appeal, Kenneth maintained that the court's final instructions went substantially beyond the statutory language, telling the jury that, quote, if the defendant intentionally aided the decedent in taking his own life, or if the defendant encouraged or advised the decedent to take his own life, that is assisted suicide. However, if the defendant actively caused the decedent's death, even with the decedent's consent, then that is not assisted suicide because the consent of the victim is not a defense to murder. While the jury deliberated, they sent out a note asking for the definition of the word active, as it related to what the state had said about Kenneth actively causing Jeffrey's death. The defense, who had objected to the wording of the original charge, in particular to the passive/active distinction created by the court, objected to further defining the term. The defense instead asked the court to simply read the standard jury instructions, which had been Kenneth's position when the charge was first given. The court rejected this request, and the jury was instructed that active means doing something, carrying out an actual process, or carrying out by involvement, energy, or action. The argument in the appeal is that the court misstated the law on the assisted suicide defense, and then several court decisions were cited as the appellate court ruled that they felt the court was erroneous in jury instructions regarding assisted suicide. The trial had presented two very different scenarios of Jeffrey's death. The state said that Kenneth stabbed him as he lay prone in the seat of his car. The defense said Jeffrey impaled himself onto the knife held by Kenneth. The court agreed with the prosecution that their version, if accepted by the jury, would constitute murder, not assisted suicide. If Jeffrey took no part whatsoever in the ultimate act that led to his death, it cannot be characterized as suicide, even if the record shows Jeffrey wanted to die. In this regard, we find the jury's verdict convicting Kenneth Minor of murder was based on legally sufficient evidence. The testimony of the state's medical expert provided ample proof that Kenneth repeatedly stabbed the decedent. Based on this evidence, the jury was entitled to reject his claim that he merely held the knife. However, the jury was also free to accept Kenneth's versions of events. Under that version, the jury could have found that Jeffrey committed suicide because he committed the final overt act that caused his death, i.e., thrusting himself onto the knife. Notably, the state did not argue that Kenneth's version, if believed, would not satisfy the affirmative defense to murder. In fact, the record shows that the state acquiesced to the defense being charged, and they do not argue otherwise on appeal. The state made no objection to the charge and, in fact, offered their own proposed language to the court. The trial court determined that the defendant's version supported the assisted suicide defense because it decided to give the charge. That being said, the portion of the court's instruction that the assisted suicide defense is not made out if Kenneth actively caused Jeffrey's death, along with the expansive definition of the word active given, it was confusing and conveyed the wrong standard to the jury. Neither the word active nor its antonym passive appears in the statutory language, and thus, By giving this charge, the court added an element that is not a part of the defense. Moreover, although sparse, the legislative history of the current statute supports the view that assisted suicide defense allows for at least some active assistance to one who commits suicide. And the fact that assisted suicide exists as an affirmative defense to murder shows that active conduct could be included in the defense. The jury was required to consider the affirmative defense only upon finding that the defendant intentionally caused Jeffrey's death, which necessarily means he engaged in some act of conduct that caused the death. But the court's instruction to the jury that if the defendant actively caused Jeffrey's death, then he was not entitled to the affirmative defense of assisted suicide. Such instruction was confusing and could have led the jury to conclude that if they found intentional murder, the affirmative defense was not applicable. By using the phrase actively caused, the court effectively thwarted the affirmative defense and mandated a directed verdict of guilty. In addition to that, the court's error was compounded by the overly broad definition of the term active. The court told the jury that active meant doing something, carrying out an actual process, or carrying out by involvement, energy, or action. The assisted suicide defense exists to protect murder charges against those who assist others to commit suicide. A person obviously cannot provide assistance to one committing suicide without doing something. The jury could have been confused into thinking that Kenneth taking out the knife or holding the knife was doing something actively, and that would constitute murder, not assisted suicide. By adding words not used in the statute, the court effectively rewrote it and imposed a greater burden on Kenneth Minor than the statute required. The appellate court cited more court rulings and said more stuff, but we get the gist of it. They concluded that the conviction should be reversed because of improper jury instruction, and Kenneth's case was remanded for a new trial. In New York, assisted suicide is not murder. It is considered second-degree manslaughter, and the judge erred in not making this clear to the jury. In September of 2014, Kenneth went ahead and accepted to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and his original 20-year sentence was reduced to 12 years. He did what he said he was going to do all along, accept responsibility for what he did, telling the court that he made the choice and he accepts the punishment. By the time Kenneth was given his plea, he had served 5 years on his term. And while I did not find the information in a news article about him being released, I did find a Facebook page dedicated to him on which there is very little activity, but it appears as though he was released from prison in August of 2019. There are captions on his most recent pictures that say, "My brother is home." So, in all, Kenneth served almost exactly 10 years from the time that he was taken into custody. I have no information about Jeffrey Locker's family, and frankly, I'm okay with that. While Kenneth Minor shouldn't have done what he did, there's that part of us that knows that, yeah, he wanted the money, but I believed him when he described what it meant to him for Jeffrey to want to end his life with him. I can understand why the sympathy of the jury fell upon Kenneth and not Jeffrey and his family. If Kenneth was in this for the money, then yeah, well, so the Lockers were very much in it for the same reasons, many, many, many times over. And I hope all the best for Kenneth in his freedom. I read an article from February of 2020 in the Fordham Law School newsletter website about this case, and I wanted to read it to you before we end this. It says, Fordham Law students had the rare opportunity to hear directly from the players in the 2010 People v. Kenneth Minor case, including the defendant, the defendant's attorneys, and a juror. The discussion, which took place on January 28, 2020, was part of Fordham Law's Criminal Law Speaker Series, a class which brings together judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and professors with law students to discuss landmark criminal cases and groundbreaking legal research and ideas. On July 16, 2009, Long Island motivational speaker Jeffrey Locker was found stabbed to death in his car in East Harlem. Police initially thought that he was the victim of a violent robbery, but collected evidence and testimonies that showed Locker, ridden with debt, faked the crime with help from another individual. Kenneth Miner, who was caught after the incident using Locker's ATM card, was arrested. He told police that Locker asked him to kill him, but that the death had to look like a homicide so his family could receive $12 million in life insurance. Miner said that he held a knife from Locker's glove compartment against the steering wheel while Locker lunged himself forward 7 times. Now, dreamers, the articles on this case that I cited throughout this episode all said 6 times, but this particular article said 7. When Miner left, Locker was allegedly still alive. Speaking softly as he remembered the details of meeting Locker, Miner told the class that he and Locker were just 2 ships in the night, interacting with one another for a few hours before Locker's death. At the time, Miner was under the influence of cocaine and alcohol, which he said lowered his inhibitions. Despite trying to chase Locker away, Miner was impressed that he came back. Miner said that his intentions was to take Locker's money, not to be part of his death later that night. Though he tried dissuading Locker, he changed his mind because he understood where Locker was coming from. Somewhere along the line, it seemed like a good idea to help out, and it was not. He was in a bad mental state, and I took advantage of that. And I know that nobody is supposed to do that, Miner said, in front of the rows of students as he sat between his 2 former attorneys. You can't really motivate me to do anything unless I want to. If I did it, I meant it. It was a poor decision, one of many. Daniel Gotlin, a partner at Gotlin & Jaffe, who joined Miner for the discussion, was called to represent Miner because he was on an indigent defense panel under County Law Article 18b, which dealt exclusively with murder cases and trials. The 2 met and spoke about what happened that night, with Gotlin noting that it was the most bizarre thing he'd ever heard. Within a matter of days, it became more apparent that Miner was telling the truth based on Locker's debt records, conversations between family members that suggested a conspiracy, and the fact that this was not Locker's first attempt at trawling East Harlem to find someone to kill him. At that point, Gotlin also put his colleague Lawrence Fleischer on the case. Miner was charged with murder in the 2nd degree, robbery in the 1st degree, and murder in the 1st degree, the last 2 eventually being dismissed. Gotlin successfully moved to order to dismiss the indictment and compelled the prosecution to present the case to a new grand jury focusing on manslaughter in the 2nd degree. Olympia Moy was a member of the jury in the case in 2011. She and the other jurors agreed that it seemed that Locker had arranged his own death and had gone through deliberate actions to follow through on it. Deliberations became complicated when the jurors factored in the testimony of Melvin Fleming, who was solicited by Locker days earlier and received some cash, but did not participate in Locker's death. Moy explained that questions regarding self-determination cropped up because Locker had gone repeatedly to predominantly African American neighborhoods, seeking out low-income men to take part in his plan. Fleming's testimony hurt me because it showed that my morals were lower than Fleming's, Miner said. However, the central issue became whether or not Miner was entitled to the affirmative defense, which used the words causes or aids, meaning there is no distinction between active or passive conduct. The jury sent out a note for clarification on the word active. Moy said that Judge Carol Berkman read the definition from a pocket-sized dictionary. But in the jury instruction, she also inserted a however. Judge Berkman said if Miner caused Locker's death, even with Locker's consent, then that is not assisted suicide because the consent of the victim is not a defense to murder. Our position had been that it really didn't matter at all because if you read the statute, it never said active or passive, Gotlin said. It doesn't matter if Miner plunged the knife into Locker. In addition, Fleischer had analyzed the issue in meticulous detail in New York and other states. According to Gotlin, Judge Berkman was not willing to accept the defense's interpretation of the statute. Olympia Moy recollected that the question of whether Miner's participation was active or passive made it difficult for the jury to reach a verdict. Among some jurors, there was a lot of fixation on whether or not Locker had impaled himself repeatedly on the knife that was held against the steering wheel versus being stabbed. Some people said that's irrelevant now, we'll never know, and any participation would necessarily be active, Moy said. The way we were given the instruction, there was really nothing to deliberate, and our hands were sort of tied because we weren't allowed to really consider the affirmative defense. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before they announced their verdict, to which Miner was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. I said, "Wow, that was pretty fast," Miner said to the class. "I thought they were trying to make it home for dinner." A day after the conviction, Moy still felt troubled by the lack of logic with the judge's instruction and spoke to 2 friends who attended law school. One friend reached out to a law professor who had responded, and there was no legal use for Moy to reach out to the defense. Regardless, Moy contacted Dan Gotlin to provide moral support, and he later made out a motion to set aside the verdict, in part due to Moy's affidavit that stated that the judge's direction had caused juror confusion. The appellate court later reversed the judge's decision 5-0 due to the improper instruction. With the aid of Miss Moy, she affirmed for us that the judge was wrong. It was very unusual. Jurors are not nearly as responsible and heroic as she is, said Fleischer. Miner, who has not discussed the case since 2012 with CBS's 48 Hours, told the students that he recognizes his past mistakes. "I went through 10 very hard years paying for it, but I'll never finish paying for it. The only way I can move forward is to pay it forward, to make sure that no one else can end up in a situation like that. And the only way to do that is to speak about it from time to time." Fordham Law student Sydney Rosenblum, who cautiously revealed to the room at the very end that she lived in the same town as the Locker family and went to high school with the Locker's children, said the day was very moving for her. "For all of you to be here, it is just more infuriating, honestly, with how his family handled everything and the way it went down," she said before directing her last comment to Kenneth Miner. "Though you made yourself believe that you could have caused the death, I don't believe that. I think Locker was on a mission, and you, unfortunately, were a part of that a little bit, but you didn't deserve that." And that will bring this 165th episode of California Dreaming to a close. Please come over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It's there we discuss the cases that we cover, and not just the cases we cover on this show, but whatever podcasts you listen to, documentaries that you've watched, books you've recently read, as well as current news stories. We post about pets, post funny memes. Please come on over and share. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at California Pod and Instagram at California Dreaming Pod. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to with an eclectic roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports, entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You'll find the links to all of the podcasts on the network, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams.